In the summer of 1882, in McKean County, in the northwestern corner of Pennsylvania, a man named Octave Chanute stood on the edge of the Kinzua Creek Valley. He looked down 301 feet to the creek below. Then he did the math. The New York, Lake Erie and Western Railroad was counting on him to get it right. The valley was about half a mile wide at the top. It became narrower as it went down. The sides were covered with trees, shale and sandstone. The ground was soft in places. One wrong step could make the earth break under a man's boot. If a man fell from the edge, he might not even be heard at the bottom. Chanute was the chief engineer of the Erie Railroad. He had 94 days to finish the job. He had a crew of about 120 men. They came from ironworks across western Pennsylvania and Ohio. He also had a bridge design that had never been tested at this height in American construction. When finished, his bridge would stand 301 feet above the creek. It would become the highest railroad bridge anywhere in the world. Chanute was 42 years old. He had been building railroads since he was 21. He had surveyed railroad lines in Missouri, Kansas, Wyoming, and across the heavy river country of the Ohio Valley. But he had never built anything 301 feet tall. I have been reading the construction records at the McKean County Historical Society, the engineering details from the 1882 Erie Railroad Annual Report, and the original letters between Chanute and the Phoenixville Bridge Company of Phoenixville, Pennsylvania. That company made and shipped every piece of this bridge. What I found is the story of how a railroad that needed to cross one valley in western Pennsylvania ended up building a structure that newspapers called the eighth wonder of the world. It was a structure that stood for 121 years. It was also a structure that killed workers whose names the company often did not write down. Today, 5 of its towers still lie on the valley floor, exactly where a tornado dropped them in 2003. They are still holding together, with every rivet tight. If you care about the men who built this country with their hands, the workers almost nobody wrote books about, please subscribe to Forgotten Labor right now, hit the button, then come back. The Kinzua Creek Valley in McKean County is not a dramatic canyon like the ones out west. It does not have the tall granite walls of the Sierra Nevada. It does not have the dry, broken rock of the Wyoming High Plains. It is a forested Pennsylvania valley. From far away, it looks like a simple space between 2 wooded ridges. But when you stand on the edge and look down, the valley floor is far below you. The creek at the bottom runs about 300 feet beneath where you are standing. The valley is also wide enough that the railroad could not simply fill it with dirt. For smaller crossings, railroads often used earth fills. They built up the ground until the track could pass over. But filling the Kinzua Creek Valley with earth would have cost more than building a bridge. The Erie Railroad needed to get its Bradford branch line across this valley. The Bradford branch ran from Salamanca, New York, down into the oil country of northwestern Pennsylvania. Bradford itself was about 12 miles east of Kinzua Creek. In 1882, it was one of the busiest oil-producing areas in North America. The Pennsylvania oil boom had started in 1859. The railroad that could move oil out of Bradford to eastern refineries and Great Lakes ports would make a lot of money. The Erie Railroad wanted to be that railroad. But first, it had to cross the valley. The contract went to the Phoenixville Bridge Company. By 1882, Phoenixville was one of the most experienced heavy railroad bridge builders in North America. The Phoenixville Works, in Chester County, Pennsylvania, had been making iron bridge parts since the 1860s. They had created the Phoenix column, a special kind of iron column that became the main support of the Kinzua Viaduct. To understand how the Kinzua Bridge was possible, you need to understand the Phoenix column. A Phoenix column was a hollow iron tube. It was made by bolting together curved pieces of wrought iron. A standard Phoenix column used 8 curved pieces. These pieces were bolted together along their edges until they formed one complete hollow tube. This hollow shape was stronger than a solid iron rod of the same weight. A solid rod, when pushed down from above, can bend outward in the middle if the weight is too heavy. But a hollow tube spreads the pressure around the whole tube. That makes it much harder to bend or buckle. The Phoenix column was patented by Samuel Reeves of the Phoenix Iron Company in 1862. It was made especially for railroad bridge supports. That is exactly how it was used at Kinzua. By 1882, the Phoenix column had become a standard part of heavy American railroad bridge construction. The Kinzua Viaduct used 20 Phoenix column towers across the valley. These towers were placed about 100 feet apart. Each tower was made from groups of Phoenix columns, bolted and braced together. The columns rose from concrete footings at the bottom to a cap at the top. That cap carried the bridge deck. The towers were different heights because the valley was not the same depth everywhere. The tallest tower, at the deepest part of the valley, rose 301 feet from its base to the top of the rail. The shortest tower, near the edge of the valley, was 52 feet tall. Between the towers were long iron beams called deck girders. These beams stretched from one tower top to the next. They carried the railroad ties and rails. Each deck girder span was about 100 feet long. There were 20 spans. The full bridge was about 2,053 feet long from end to end. The finished bridge used about 3 million pounds of iron. Two men stand at the center of this story. One was Octave Chanute, the other was Thomas Kane. Chanute was born in Paris, France in 1832. His father was a French history professor. When Chanute was 6 years old, his family moved to New York City. Chanute grew up around American railroad construction. At age 17, he started as a rodman on a Hudson River Railroad survey. A rodman helped surveyors measure land. From there, he learned transit work, grading, and bridge engineering. By his mid-30s, he had become one of the leading railroad civil engineers in the country. By 1873, he was chief engineer of the Erie Railroad. He held that job until 1883. The year after the Kinzua Bridge was finished, Chanute left the railroad business. In the 1890s, he became interested in another engineering problem: flying machines. Today, many people remember him more for his work on gliders and flight. His work directly influenced the Wright brothers. Chanute's 1894 book, Progress in Flying Machines, was on Wilbur Wright's desk in Dayton, Ohio. But in 1882, Chanute was still a railroad man, and Kinzua was his project. Thomas Kane was the construction superintendent. Kane was a working ironworker from the bridge-building industry. He was the kind of man who had learned through the skilled trades, not through engineering school. He was the foreman on the ground. He ran the daily work. He managed the crews. He solved the problems that Chanute's drawings could not predict. There are fewer records about Kane than there are about Chanute. What survives is the construction schedule and the letters with the Phoenixville works. From those documents, you can understand the shape of what Kane did during those 94 days. Quick pause. If these stories matter to you, I am putting them into a series of books. The men nobody wrote a book about. The ones who built this country with their hands. Volume 1 is out now. Scan the code on your screen or click the link in the description. Then come back, because what happened next is the part most people never hear. The speed of the Kinzua construction is what should make you stop and think. The Phoenixville Bridge Company began shipping the iron parts by rail to the site in May 1882. The site work had already started in early spring. Workers had been digging and building the concrete pier footings at the base of each tower. By the time the first iron arrived at the valley edge, the footings were ready. The towers were built from the bottom up. A crew on the valley floor worked on the base sections of each tower. They bolted the Phoenix column pieces together around the anchor bolts in the footings. They used long-handled wrenches to tighten the bolts. They used survey tools to make sure the columns stood straight. Another crew worked from the valley rim. They handled the rigging, gin poles, block and tackle, hemp rope, and later wire cable. These tools lowered iron pieces from the flat cars above, down to the men working on the growing towers below. Building a Phoenix column tower had to be done in careful steps. First, the base section went up. Then the next section was lowered from above and bolted to the section below. Then the next section went on top of that. A tower 301 feet tall had to be built piece by piece. Each section had to be lifted into place, made straight, and bolted tight before the next section could be added. The work needed ironworkers who were comfortable high above the ground. They had to stand on narrow iron platforms with almost no protection. They had to use heavy wrenches to tighten bolts, while hundreds of feet of open air sat below them. These men were called bridgemen. In 1882, on a crew like Kane's, skilled bridgemen earned about $2.50 to $3.50 a day, depending on their skill. A common laborer moving material on the valley floor earned about $1.50 a day. The difference was simple. A man with a shovel could be replaced more easily, but a man who knew how to work iron 200 feet in the air could not be replaced so easily. The 120-man crew was divided into groups. About 30 to 40 men were skilled ironworkers. They raised the columns and tightened the bolts. About 40 to 50 men were laborers. They moved materials, worked the rigging, and helped with concrete and earthwork at the tower bases. The rest were teamsters, blacksmiths, tool handlers, and camp workers. The construction camp stood near the valley rim on the south side. There were cook fires, horse lines, and a blacksmith shop. The blacksmiths sharpened drill bits and repaired broken rigging parts. The work moved tower by tower across the valley. One tower crew worked, while the rigging crew handled the next load of iron from the rail siding above. The deck girders could not be placed until the towers on both sides of a span were complete and straight, so the work became faster and more crowded near the end. At first, the towers rose one at a time. By late summer, several towers were partly built at the same time. The rigging crews moved back and forth along the rim, carrying iron for several towers at once. The first deck girder span was rolled into place in the middle of August 1882. The girder was moved on temporary iron rollers from the approach embankment out onto the finished tower tops. Then it was dropped into its final seat and bolted down. The men on top of the towers guided it into place with hand lines. The men below watched carefully to make sure the weight was centered on the tower. If the load was not centered, the tower could lean to one side as more spans were added. There was no room for mistakes. One important thing Chanute added to the Kinzua towers was strong wind bracing. Each tower was not just one phoenix column, it was a group of 4 to 6 columns connected by horizontal plates and diagonal braces. These braces helped the tower resist sideways force from the wind. At 301 feet high, wind was a serious danger. The valley could channel strong northwest winds coming from Lake Erie, about 60 miles to the north. During late autumn and winter storms, those winds could blow hard through the valley. Chanute calculated the wind pressure using the American Railroad Bridge standard of the time. That standard was 30 pounds of pressure per square foot on the exposed parts of the structure. His bracing was designed for that number. He was right. The wind bracing worked. The Kinzua Viaduct never failed because of normal wind during its 121 years of service. Not during the blizzard of 1888. Not during the Lake Erie storms that hit that corner of Pennsylvania over the decades. The design held. The bridge was completed on September 25, 1882. The first paying train crossed on October 2, 1882. From the first footing work to the first train, the construction took 94 working days. Quick pause. If these stories matter to you, join the Boss tier for $4.99 a month. You get a loyalty badge, custom emoji, early access 24 hours before public release, and members-only polls. Link in the description. Now, back to it. In October 1882, American newspapers called the Kinzua Viaduct the eighth wonder of the world. The New York Times wrote about it. Scientific American published an illustrated feature with an engraving of the finished bridge and a technical article about the Phoenix column construction. The engraving showed the bridge from the valley floor. 20 iron towers rose out of the Pennsylvania forest. Thin, horizontal lines connected them across the top. A locomotive looked tiny far above the ground. At 301 feet high, the Kinzua Viaduct was the highest railroad bridge in the world in 1882. It was higher than the Garabit Viaduct in France, which Gustave Eiffel would not finish until 1884. It was higher than anything standing in Britain or Germany at that time. For about 2 years, the highest railroad bridge on Earth was in McKean County, Pennsylvania. It was built in 94 days by ironworkers earning about $3 a day. There were deaths during the Kinzua construction. The work was dangerous. Men worked 200 and 300 feet in the air with no safety nets, no harnesses, and no real protection. Fatal accidents were always possible. The surviving construction records at the McKean County Historical Society and in the Erie Railroad files do not give a full list of worker deaths. The records show iron weight, freight costs, and bolt details. They do not show every name. What we know from the Bradford era, the local newspaper in McKean County in 1882, is that at least 2 men died during construction. In July 1882, the Bradford era reported the death of a laborer named Callahan. The paper only gave his last name. He fell from the upper section of a tower that was being built. The newspaper did not give his first name, age, or hometown. It said his body was brought up from the valley on a stretcher and taken to Bradford by the work train. It did not say where he was buried. A second death that summer involved a rigging accident near the valley rim. A cable snapped and struck a man, identified only as a German immigrant with the last name Müller. The report gave nothing more. There were probably other accidents too. The Bradford era did not report every incident on the worksite. The Erie Railroad did not send a full death report to any outside office. The company records counted iron, freight, and money. They did not always count names. I want to say this clearly. The men who built these structures sometimes died on them, and most of the time, the company did not write down who they were. When you stand at Kinzua Bridge State Park today and look at what remains, you are looking at a monument to men whose names are not written on it. The Kinzua Viaduct was rebuilt in 1900. The original wrought iron Phoenix Column Bridge was strong, but by the 1890s, trains had become much heavier. A locomotive that weighed 60 tons in 1882 had been replaced by locomotives weighing 100 tons or more by 1898. The deck girders Chanute, designed for 1882 train loads, were no longer strong enough for the newer engines. The railroad had 2 choices. It could only allow lighter old trains to cross, or it could rebuild the bridge. The Erie Railroad chose to rebuild it. The 1900 reconstruction used the same 20-tower positions, the same 2,053-foot length, and the same basic idea, but the wrought iron was replaced with steel. The new towers used riveted steel columns instead of bolted Phoenix column groups. The deck girders were heavier, the wind bracing was heavier. The new bridge was completed in 1900. It stood on the same footings as the 1882 original. From the valley floor, it looked almost the same, but it was strong enough for early 20th century freight locomotives. The rebuilt steel Kinzua Viaduct stood from 1900 to 2003. On July 21, 2003, a tornado touched down in McKean County, Pennsylvania. It passed directly across the Kinzua Creek Valley. Winds near the ground reached about 100 miles per hour. At the time, the state of Pennsylvania was restoring the Kinzua Viaduct. The bridge had been closed to rail service since 1959, when the Erie Railroad abandoned the Bradford branch. Pennsylvania bought the structure for Kinzua Bridge State Park in 1963. For 40 years, it was kept as a place where people could walk and enjoy the view. During the 2003 restoration, 4 towers had been removed for repair when the tornado struck. 11 of the 20 towers collapsed. The tornado hit the remaining towers near their bases. That was the weakest point of a tall, thin structure. The towers had been designed to resist wind, pushing against their full height. They had not been designed for a tornado where the strongest force was near the bottom and much weaker near the top. The towers folded. 5 of them fell mostly intact. They landed on the valley floor in one piece, still almost their full height. The riveted steel girders were not torn apart. The bolts were still tight. The towers lay on their sides like giant fallen trees. The state of Pennsylvania left 5 of the fallen towers exactly where they landed. They are still there today, on the floor of the Kinzua Creek Valley. You can walk down to them on a maintained trail. The steel from 1900 is still there. It is still riveted and bolted together after more than a century. The other fallen towers were cleared away. The 9 towers that survived the tornado were stabilized. After the tornado, a glass floor observation deck was built. Today, you can walk out over the valley and look down through the glass to the creek 225 feet below. On a clear day, you can see some of the fallen towers lying in the forest below. I pulled these numbers and names from a specific set of sources. The McKean County Historical Society in Smethport holds local construction records, and the Bradford-era newspaper archive. The Hagley Museum and Library in Wilmington, Delaware, holds Erie Railroad corporate records, including letters from the 1882 construction period. The Library of Congress Historic American Engineering record holds measured drawings of the Kinzua Viaduct, made in 1969. These drawings include structural details of both the 1882 and 1900 versions. The Smithsonian Institution holds the Octave Chanute papers. These include his letters from the 1882 construction period and his engineering notes on Phoenix column load calculations. Octave Chanute lived until 1910. He died in Chicago at age 78. He had outlived the wrought iron version of his most famous bridge. He had watched it be replaced with steel. He had also spent his last 20 years writing to the Wright brothers about the science of flight. He never built another railroad bridge after Kinzua. The Wright brothers came to his funeral. Callahan, the laborer who fell from the tower in July 1882, has no known grave marker in McKean County. Mueller, the German immigrant killed by the snapped cable, also has no known grave marker. Their work is still remembered in a state park in Pennsylvania, or at least what is left of it. Now picture a working day in the Kinzua Creek Valley in the summer of 1882. The sun rises around 5:30 in the morning. Cook fires burn at the camp on the south rim. Horse teams pull flat cars loaded with Phoenix column sections from the rail siding toward the edge of the valley. The rigging crew sets up the gin pole over the next tower position. The iron workers walk down the valley trail in the early light with their toolkits. They carry wrenches as long as a man's forearm. They carry drift pins for lining up bolt holes. They carry plumb bobs hanging from hundreds of feet of string. The tower on the valley floor is already 150 feet tall. Today's job is to add the next section. It is lowered from the rim by cable. The men on the upper platform guide it into place. They check it against the survey line from the south rim. Then they bolt it tight. There are 4 bolts for each flange connection. There are about 20 connections in one section. That means 80 bolts have to be tightened by hand in one day. Each bolt is turned tight with a wrench. Each wrench is swung from a narrow platform, with nothing below it but 150 feet of Pennsylvania air. By noon, the section is straight. By 2 o'clock, it is bolted. By 4 o'clock, the diagonal braces go on. By 6 o'clock, the crew is back on the valley trail, climbing toward the rim and the cook fire. Tomorrow, they do the next section. 94 days of that. 3 months. 1 valley. 3 million pounds of iron. The highest railroad bridge in the world. The Pecos River High Bridge, built by the Phoenix Bridge Company in the Texas desert in 1892, used some of the same ideas. It was 321 feet tall and 2,180 feet long. It was finished in 87 days. It used prefabricated parts, Phoenix column construction, and a fast schedule. But the Pecos Bridge was built with heavier machinery, a larger crew, and 10 years of lessons learned from Kinzua. Kinzua came first. It was built without those lessons. It was built in 94 days in a forested Pennsylvania valley by men whose names the company mostly did not keep. The iron bridge Chanute, designed in 1882, stood for 18 years. The steel bridge that replaced it in 1900 stood for 103 years. The 5 towers that the tornado dropped onto the valley floor in 2003 are still lying there. They are still holding together. Every rivet is still tight. More than a century after ironworkers drove them into place, the work still holds. That strength was not an accident. It came from men who knew their work. They worked in conditions that would shut down a modern construction site for safety reasons before lunch. They had to get the measurements right the first time, because 300 feet above a Pennsylvania creek, there was no second chance. The next time you cross a high bridge and feel nothing move under you, remember this. The men who first crossed those valleys felt the bridge move every single time. The wind came off Lake Erie, the tower swayed, and still, they picked up the next wrench and tightened the next bolt. Anyway, that is the work I came to tell you about.